People First Radio is a program about people, the society in which we live, and issues related to health and wellness.
Welcome to People First Radio. I'm Joe Pugh. On today's program, we're going to hear from a pair of authors and researchers who've taken a critical lens to some parts of the culture around autism. Patty Douglas writes that she is the mother of a son who has attracted the label of autism. She explores the narratives around motherhood and autism over the years, with mothers often getting blamed. From the cold refrigerator mother who was seen as a potential cause of autism in the 1950s, to the idea of the warrior mother who is expected to be hyper-vigilant in a constant battle against autism. In her book, Unmothering Autism, Douglas questioned those narratives and how their legacy impacts the culture around autism today. We'll hear from her later on in today's program. But first, Julia Gruson-Wood explores the culture around a treatment that's garnered controversy. Applied Behaviour Analysis, or ABA, is one of the most common interventions for autistic children. Some autistic people with experience of it and advocacy groups describe it as harmful. The Autism Self-Advocacy Network, for example, writes that ABA aims to train autistic people to act non-autistic, and that it and other therapies with the same goals can hurt autistic people and don't teach the skills autistic people actually need to navigate the world with their disabilities. Around 10 years ago, Gruson-Wood put out a research call and spoke with a number of people who provided ABA. She says many of the conversations were cagey at first, with people trying to suss out what her angle was. Eventually, some people working in the field shared criticisms of it with Gruson-Wood, but they also shared that they felt they couldn't express those concerns publicly for fear of being blacklisted. That inspired Gruson-Wood to dig a little deeper. That work led to the forthcoming book, Autism and the Culture of Therapy. I spoke about it with Julia Gruson-Wood.
My name is Julia Gruson-Wood. I am a social studies of health researcher. I'm an adjunct professor at University of Guelph, and I work at the University of Toronto as a research partnerships officer.
And we are going to be talking about a book you have written. It is called Autism and the Culture of Therapy. And I think an important place to start this conversation is trying to define or at least provide some context around a definition of what people understand when they say the word autism.
Ooh, that's a big one. And I would say that autism has been many things over many periods of time, and it remains to be so. You know, autism began like in the 1910s to the 1940s-ish as being sort of considered a symptom of this broader definition called childhood schizophrenia. It moved to being seen as this sort of psychogenic disorder, quote unquote, by people like Bettelheim and the likes who, blamed cold refrigerator mothers primarily for giving their children autism. And then there was the behavioral turn in the 60s and 70s, which is really my focus of the sort of what happened to the behavioral turn. And this is the idea that autism is a set of behaviors that can be modified. And then, of course, in the 1990s, there's this huge, powerful neurodiversity movement led by autistic self-advocates and their allies saying autism is a form of neurological difference, similar to differences like gender, race, class, and actually the struggle to be seen as equal, to be seen as valid, is similar to like another kind of civil rights struggle to be seen as equal and a struggle for justice. And now there's like so many competing ideas of what autism is, and you see this playing out in the public sphere, like even just like very recently, this idea of Tylenol causing autism with like RFK in the States. And obviously, the sort of underlying sense there is autism is a bad thing to be avoided, right? Versus this, really again, strong neurodiversity movement, which is about autism as a valid form of neurological difference. So, autism means many things to many people and probably will continue to be so and continue to evolve for many years to come.
On that front, maybe I'll just share what the Health Canada page says about autism, and maybe ask you, as a researcher who's been focusing on this topic for years, if there's any context you'd provide around that. So here's what it says on the website. It says autism, also known as autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition. Autistic people may communicate and connect with other people differently, have sensory processing differences, focus intensely on certain interests and activities. Autistic people may also have other physical, intellectual, learning, or mental health conditions, which can introduce complexities and challenges. Everyone has different experiences and characteristics, so the type and extent of supports should adapt to individual needs. So that there's more to the page, but that is kind of the beginning of the Health Canada definition of autism. Anything you think people need to know as extra context around that?
Hmm. It's not that I agree or disagree. Like as a social scientist, primarily from an anthropological perspective, my approach to autism is to understand the social meanings of autism, where they sit in where these meanings sit in culture, and how these meanings shift over time. And so, yeah, I mean that seems to me like the one of a social understanding of autism right now, and maps onto how autism is diagnosed, how self-diagnosis happens, and the key kind of characteristics of what autism is today.
And in your work, you have focused on the titular culture of therapy. To really understand what you were talking about, we're going to have to understand what ABA, Applied Behaviour Analysis, is. I understand this is kind of the thing in the world of treatment, if it's fair to say, for autism.
Yeah, totally. It's like the primary intervention. Um, Still, I would say definitely, at the time of, I'll just say most of my research on autism and the book that we're talking about today, it comprises field work that I did from 2014 to 2016. And so what I've done is a recent history of autism and behavioral therapies. And at the time of writing, behavioral therapies had exploded. They were huge. They were definitely the primary therapy being funded by our Ontario government. There was this huge push and struggle for professionalization. And so, yes, so these therapies were burgeoning in the early 2000s, the late 1990s even, and then became a dominant model.
What is ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, and like what is kind of the space it takes up in the autism world?
Yeah. Okay. So applied behavioral analysis, it's hard to really do justice to what this is without getting super jargony. So I'm going to try my best not to get super jargony. Applied behavioral analysis, it 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 is a kind of radical behaviorism, which is the idea that behaviors are modified through your environment, through things called antecedents and and consequences. Antecedents is what happens before a behavior. Consequence is what happens after a behavior. And so who we are as humans in the world of applied behavioral analysis is not deep. Like psychology is deep, right? It's like mining your inner thoughts and like talk therapy and your subconscious. Behavioral therapy is like, what is your environment? And not to say it's not complex, it's very complex. What is your environment? What happened right before you had that behavior? Like, for example, running home. Okay, I ran home one day because it was raining outside. The rain was my environment, and the running was my reaction to the rain that came down. And so, really, applied behavioral analysis is about understanding, charting, and graphing the antecedents and behaviors antecedents and consequences that result in certain behaviors and then modifying the environment in order to change the behaviors. And the modification often happens through repetition, through data tracking, and through getting lots of people involved and on board so that there's consistency in people's environment. So if you wanted somebody to learn to brush their teeth, you might set up a toothbrush to the right and give a prompt. Okay, put the toothbrush on now. Okay, brushing their teeth. Okay, put on the faucet to take the toothpaste off, and they'll put it back where it belongs. And then going through that again and again and again and again to make sure that the learning of brushing your teeth has been successful.
And could you tell me, how does this come into an intervention for autism?
Mm. Well, it came in to an intervention for autism through somebody called Ole Ivar Lovaas. He was an American-Norwegian clinical psychologist in the 60s. He started the Lovaas Clinic at UCLA. He started the first ABA clinic with autistic kids, but also with quote unquote gender deviant children as well. So there was kind of these parallel populations that he was testing this out with. And he did an intensive version of applied behavioral analysis called early intensive behavior intervention, which involved a sort of total immersive therapeutic environment for the child undergoing these therapies. And that meant that enter scene parents becoming therapists. And so they would suddenly have to apply these therapies in the home. And Lovaas thought parents were essential because that's the only way you could possibly have this total and immersive environment for autistic kids to learn these behaviors. And as he said, I think he said approximate the normal citizen after that. Those were his kind of wild claims about his therapy. So that's how it began.
Could you give me a sense of how someone gets involved with some kind of diagnosis or treatment or intervention for autism and when that is happening in someone's life?
Mm. Yeah. Well, that also has changed over time, but I would say like right now, probably one of the primary places would be like a public school. And a teacher noticing a child has different needs within the classroom and having something called an individualized education plan, and perhaps telling the parents, hey, you might want to get an assessment. And then you go to like a psychometrist or, a sort of diagnostic clinic. They would go through a bunch of tests, and then you would be labeled or not labeled as being on, now it would be ASD, autism spectrum disorder.
So let's say that happens. Obviously, everyone is going to be different. Every case that happens is going to be different. That's the whole idea behind this IEP, individualized education plan. But what are some of the next steps that might follow on from that?
Yes. Well, it would depend on the quote unquote like severity of the case. And also the age. So if somebody is like diagnosed super young, let's say before the age of 5, they still might be told that there is a rush to get them what I just was talking about, the early intensive behavior intervention. That's like the kind of like immersive, many, 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 many hours, 40 plus hours a week of ABA in a total environment to quote unquote catch that early intervention window. These ideas have, I think, started to shift a little bit, but certainly up to about 7 years ago, there was this idea that like before the age of 7, there was this real opportunity to impact the what's often referred to clinically as a severity of autism. So these people would probably be funneled into EIBI, and they might have to be on a wait list. If they're on a wait list for public services, then if they can scrounge up the cash, go to a private clinic, pay lots of money for private EIBI, or if they're classified as having moderate or mild autism, and again, these are all in quotes, these are all the language that is used, not the language I would choose, they might be suggested to have just ABA, go to a clinic maybe a couple times a week, or maybe have a home intervention where a clinician might or a therapist might come into the house, teach parents how to apply certain key behaviors that they want their child to learn or that would be important for their child to learn, such as teeth brushing, and work with them on like a 6-week ABA program. So it sort of depends on the type of autism diagnosis one receives and the age in which they receive it. If you are an adult being diagnosed with ASD, you might not be funneled into these therapies at all.
You're listening to People First Radio. I'm Joe Pugh. My guest is Julia Gruson-Wood. She's author of the forthcoming book, Autism and the Culture of Therapy. For the book, Gruson-Wood spoke with a number of people in the world of applied behavior analysis, an intervention commonly used with autistic children. Now, when you were doing this fieldwork 10 years ago, you described this world where there was this dominant therapy, and if you wanted to work in the field of helping people with autism, you had to really subscribe to its tenets. And then you talked to a lot of the people who did that, and they would tell you sort of off the record, I have problems X, Y, and Z with this. Or in some cases, like, I really think this is fundamentally flawed and bad. And then on the record, they might be at a conference saying, yeah, this works, as they do their presentation. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Oh my gosh. Well, that's the whole reason I wrote this book is this huge, one of the reasons I wrote this book. There's this huge culture of fear against speaking out about these therapies. And like, I'll begin with a story about myself. So I started out being critical of these therapies because, I'd seen them applied. I have a sibling with autism. I'd seen them applied to her. They were very disturbing, just because of the highly repetitive nature of them and the kind of complete and total nature of them, where it really takes away the agency of the person from what I saw. So that was my impetus. Anyways, I was like a young doctoral student, just at the proposal phase of my PhD dissertation. And I was in this like fellowship program where there was just like people like me, like just starting out their PhDs. And then we had mentors, and there was a huge like kind of network of mentors. And we all got the opportunity to present our proposal to this network of mentors. Now, every week, maybe one or two mentors would show up, right? When I presented, it was like people had like the mentors had to stand in the room because it was like overcapacity in this tiny little room. And they weren't there to support my research. They weren't there to be encouraging. They were there because they were involved in autism. They were involved in ABA, and they were there to completely eviscerate it. They were like, this is bias. This is contaminated. How dare like you be critical of this therapy when it's preventing children from poking their eyes out? Like, children aren't going to get the help they need if people speak out. And I was like, as an anthropologist, I was like, this is very interesting that a very young, like I wasn't like a teenager, but like somebody just starting out with no power within the discipline, not even a professional within the field, was getting so shut down for this research, for being critical. And that's really what I was like, oh, I need to study this culture more than just this therapy, because what is going on here where you cannot speak against it? And so then when I started talking to my interviewees, I would talk to very established clinicians, and going into the interview, some of the people I had no idea whether they were like proponents or critical of these therapies. I just knew they were big in the field. They were involved in these clinics that offered this therapy. So I wanted to talk to them. And they would be kind of doing this like little dance with me about trying to figure out what my stance was. And then it was only once they realized like, oh, I'm open to listening to critique, which took, quite a lot of work to get there with people, that they would really open up to be talking with me. But they would, even though my study was completely confidential, I anonymized the location, I anonymized the names, they would often, or one one or two people refused to even talk to me with the recorder on. And they would say to me, like, I have seen horrible things happen with these therapies. I've heard of punishments being used, taste aversives. I've seen trauma happening because, people with autism are sometimes more vulnerable to sensory related trauma. So if you're repeating the same thing over and over again, this can lead to like really traumatic outcomes for people. But they refuse to speak publicly about their views because they would, as one person would lose their invitations to the parties. But I actually think they were worried about more than that. And then I would see them speak publicly after, because I would observe all these conferences, and they would appraise the therapies pretty quickly, but they would make a point of saying something that would condone, or that would say, these are valuable, and here's this other thing. But yes, these therapies are very valuable for, young children or for autistic people or what have you. And people would tell me, if you want to work in autism, you have to agree with behavioral therapies. You can't work in this field if you disagree. And I thought that was very interesting.
We've mentioned a couple of times that this was field work you did, circa 10 years ago. Where do you feel like, do you have an idea of where things might be at now as compared to then?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. When I was doing my study, behavioral therapy was at this sort of very interesting moment where it was really people within the field were struggling to become a regulated profession. And I talked about something called the Board Certified Behavior Analysts, and this was a sort of certification board that was becoming more and more of a tacit requirement for anyone working in the field of autism, and certainly anyone providing ABA. The government would only recommend board certified therapists, and this was really changing the professional field from being more about floor work and frontline workers, social service workers, to academics. And everybody was talking at the time about how important it was to be regulated. And now it actually has become regulated as of, I think, June of last year. And it has become the Ontario Psychologists and Behavior Analysts Board. And this is very interesting to me because there has been so much work from both sides, the psychology side and the behavior analysis side, to separate themselves from each other. But here they are clumped together in this one regulatory college.
What do people need to understand about what that means?
Government funded. It's government funded, insurable, and also standardized in a way that before there was public and private providers, and there's still private providers, but now there's a huge amount of support behind it. Like as there is with psychology, if you work somewhere with a medical plan, you have likely a certain amount of psychologist hours that you can see in a year. Now behavioral therapy is part of that. So it's really a huge government investment in this therapy.
And you've talked already about how, 10 years ago you were speaking with people doing this. They had certain issues with the way behavioral therapy worked, or maybe in some cases just issues with the whole thing altogether. What do you think people need to know about that side of things in light of the whole regulation idea?
I mean, that's a really big question. They need to know so much. Let's see. They need to know that behavioral therapy, as one therapist I talked to said, we're a very convincing bunch because we have all these graphs and data. The big thing about behavioral analysis is they chart and they graph. These therapies chart and graph everything, right? And in a way, that's really good because there's you can track things, there's quote unquote evidence, but in another way, it can result in kind of funny numbers, which is like the idea that maybe certain realities are hidden, obscured, cast away because they're overtaken by the representation of these graphs and numbers as real. And so, and it's telling the whole story. So there's lots of things that can happen in these therapies that many have considered harmful. Lots of autistic adults and self-advocates have been really fighting against these therapies for a very, very long time for them to be abolished. Because they're often described as abuse.
What is the evidence in support of some of these therapies?
Yeah, that's like it's really mixed. There's some sort of longer studies that would say, we've tracked, it's kind of synthesizing a range of studies over time, saying these are really, really effective. And then there's for example, Lovaas, he did his big study in 1987, and there was some follow-up with the participants, and they were not doing so hot afterwards, and as adults and stuff. And so I would say, almost like any other kind of scientific culture or practice, there's competing evidence claims that prove and disprove the efficacy of this method.
Another thread that came up was the idea that there might be adults out there, autistic adults, who say, for example, articulate that they don't think this therapy works, or they think this therapy actively harmed them. And you described this catch-22 situation where people who articulated these claims, the response was sort of, well, you're not severely autistic, and so, this is really for the people who are and not you. Can you explain?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, that's just to me, that's one of the most infuriating things that I witnessed, is just the complete erasure of people's own experiences with these therapies. Because I mean, any group of people receiving a certain therapy or intervention or what have you, regardless of what for, should be important to the people who are providing this therapy. And yeah, so I would see there would be a number of strategies used to discount the perspectives of autistic adults who had received behavioral therapy as a kid, or who, as an adult, was speaking out against the potential harms of, if I had received this as a kid, I think this would have been really bad for me. So yeah, they would be told, well, so if they had these therapies as a kid, they would be told, well, the reason you can even speak right now is because you had these therapies and it gave you the tool to have a voice. So the very fact of you having a voice discounts, shows the effectiveness of these therapies. And that's that's just a very disempowering, there's nowhere to go from there as an autistic adult. No, that's not correct. But when somebody says that, it takes away your agency. It takes away the fact that you're not just speaking because of these therapies that you received as a child. Other people would be told, well, you have mind blindness, you're autistic, you have mind blindness, which is the idea that you can't empathize with other people. You can't see their realities as different than yours, and you're high functioning. You don't know what it's like to be quote unquote low functioning. You're just speaking for yourself, and you are doing a disservice to kids with low functioning autism. So those were some of the strategies I would see that would be used to discount autistic voices.
When you look at some of the characters who developed some of the major interventions over the years as regards autism, people like Lovaas or people like Bettelheim, or just ideas like the fact that a lot of people came out after the fact and said, for example, that Bettelheim had been in a concentration camp during the Second World War, and there was this speculation from people who had experienced the kind of residential treatment he had created, that he kind of replicated some of the things that had been done to him there on the people who lived there. And then even in the Lovas case, you talked about how kind of alongside this as an intervention for autism, it was also this sort of problematic gender behaviors in children. It was being used as an intervention for that at the same time. Like, what do you think is the takeaway from some of those developments?
I mean, not to be glib, like, not good. Not good. Like, really, really, really disturbing. Um, your podcast is about like the social determinants of health and health equity, health justice. Like these therapies were done in a very autocratic, um I mean, to say the least, disempowering way. But they started out from this old school idea of like the clinician is the expert. And sure, like a lot of healthcare providers and clinicians are experts. But when you're so authoritarian in your practice, and also when you have a view of, their views of autism were so negative, that it resulted in some very, very harmful interventions.
Do you feel like, or if so, like what is the kind of legacy of any of that in what kind of remains or what those therapies have evolved into?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I'll speak specifically of behavioral therapies. Behavior therapies, one of the things that I realized when writing my book is like, as I said, I went into this book critical of the therapies, right? But what I realized is because there's this huge kind of culture within the field of if you want to provide autism, you can't speak critically of behavioral therapies and you kind of have to provide them. Like to be in the autism world, you kind of have to provide behavioral therapies. What this resulted in is like a range of practices that like are being called behavioral therapies that are so far away from what Lovas would call behavior therapies. Like so many practices are being done in the name of behavioral therapies, but they're not these removed scientific clinical practices. As one of the parent couples that I spoke to who had to provide behavioral therapy to their son they described it as like a buffet approach, where they would like reject most things, but then might include something called like a token economy system for like swearing. Okay, so every time you swear, you have to put money in a jar, but every time someone else swears, you get that money, and then at the end of the week, you get all the cash, you know? And that's how they would provide ABA. And so really, I couldn't see a lot of practices that were a through line that I could say, oh yeah, that's ABA and that's not ABA right now. So I think that's a major difference from when the sort of what they would call the old hardcore Lovassian ABA days. Certainly that still exists, but I wouldn't say that that's like the dominant form of ABA now.
There's also this idea of the gendered nature of the field and a kind of contradiction in the fact that right now the people primarily working in it are women, but it was for the most part like the theory behind it. It was all designed and created by men.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like it's a very masculine coded method based on like automation, replicability, disinterestedness, and authority. And then you have a mostly female workforce providing these therapies and trying to come to terms with the fact that, I'll give an example. I talked to this one. She was a teenager. She was 18 years old and she was applying behavioral therapies on a volunteer basis, but very regularly at this clinic. And she was talking about the growing pains of applying ABA and working with this autistic youth who would have these behavioral outbursts. And she said, I had to learn rather than just being like, it's okay, like you're going to get through this. She said, I had to go through this learning curve of knowing that if the goal is behavior functionality, it's not kind of me to give her warmth and empathy in that moment. What is kind is to, and then she straightened her posture, her whole demeanor changed towards me, to enforce the behavior program and to follow the guidelines. And that involves being removed, taking away your kind of relatability. For her, at least, this was her iteration, and becoming very almost robotic in her responses. And so she kind of had to realign this idea of like, I can only be a nice person by towards towards my client if I become this kind of this masculinist figure. And so I really saw that struggle in a lot of people. And then of course there's the fact that almost, many behavioral therapy programs require home therapies by parapractitioners. Parapractitioners, for the most part, are mothers who are unpaid therapists. So there's this huge unpaid economy of behavior therapists that's reliant on mothers. And mothers, I also saw them struggling of like the way they relate to their child has to be cold, distanced, and removed if they want to follow the behavior protocol, which is extraordinarily painful for them as well. So there's a lot going on in terms of gender management when it comes to behavioral therapies.
So you've shared a lot of critiques of behavioral therapy. That was kind of the whole point of your research, was to investigate that and to investigate this culture you suggest exists of you can't criticize it. What do you think are the takeaways for you from this work that you've done, these critiques that people have shared, given the fact that it's this big whole apparatus and there's a whole lot of people working in this field, a whole lot of money being spent on this field? It is out there working ostensibly to help people. What do you think the takeaways are?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's a lot of takeaways. I mean, one takeaway I had was like, which I didn't think existed beforehand, but there were some behavioral therapists that I interviewed who I felt were applying the therapies in an emancipatory way. And an example of that would be this one therapist, Natalie. Every name I use is a pseudonym, by the way, who talked about seeing her job was to go into adult group homes, which is like another whole realm of behavioral therapy that nobody talks about, is that it is applied to adults as well, increasingly so. But she would talk about how her job was to go into group homes and make sure that behavior plans were being applied correctly in the group homes. And she couldn't believe, in her words, the misapplication of behavioral therapy plans in these settings. She talked about this one person who, a PSW, who was using the behavior plan to tell the adult in the setting to stop wearing his Mickey Mouse shirt because it was childish. And she's like, who are we to tell this person what to wear? Like, that person cannot be applying this. This person has agency. And this is not within the realm of behavioral therapy. And another example she gave was like somebody picking their nose and a behavioral therapy plan being created to stop nose picking. And she's like, why? Is it hurting the client? Do they have is it because there's an underlying medical issue where they have an allergy and they want to pick their nose? It's really not up to us to intervene on somebody's bodily autonomy with these therapies. And so I was like, whoa, this exists? This is kind of amazing. She kind of used behavioral therapy as a tool against oppressive practices that were being also applied through behavioral therapy. So it almost became this mirror that everybody used differently depending on how they viewed autism in a way. And so that was one take home. It's like, there's all these different ways and approaches that people are using it. And sometimes I don't think these approaches are terrible. Sometimes these people can be using this in an emancipatory way. Do not tell this person to stop picking their nose. This is their body. Back off. And then another takeaway is that because there's this push for everybody in the field to apply behavioral therapies, it's kind of lost its meaning. Everything and nothing is kind of behavioral therapy now. And also that our healthcare system relies on a lot of unpaid labor in the form of parent practitioners to keep these therapies going.
Is a sense that emerged from your work, I'm maybe doing some inferring here, correct me if I'm wrong, that it kind of felt like for people who had this therapy, it sort of its usefulness depended on so many different factors, and it was kind of like if you happened to get someone who was well suited to work with your particular child and maybe who had a particularly good outlook or way to use this, then it could be a really good and helpful thing. If you got someone who was the opposite of that, it could even be a harmful thing, and it was sort of like a big crapshoot.
100%. Actually, yeah, this one couple that I spoke to, these parents, they talked about how their first encounter with a behavioral therapist was for their son. This therapist came into the house, witnessed this mother give their son an apple. And the therapist said, what are you doing? When you can't just give your son an apple. You have to tell your son that he needs to ask for the apple and say please and cut the apple up into little bits. And every little bit he has to ask for it again. And she was like, what the expletive? I am never letting this person in my house again. And they were like, thankfully for them, upper middle class, they could like refuse the publicly funded therapist and risk that and seek out another therapist. And they said this therapist, one of the reasons that they were so sold by her is because they talked to the therapist as one of the goals they really wanted for their son was to sit down and eat family dinners with them. And this therapist said, why do you want that? Why do you want your son to sit down if he would rather be walking around? Isn't it just important that he's with you? Like, you kind of need to have a bicultural understanding. Like, he's autistic and you're not, and you might need different things. And they were like, this is the person we want, right? They both had the same exact title, very different approaches. And so I really do think the very thing that behavioral therapy wants to kind of do away with, which is subjectivity, relationships, individuality, is the very thing that makes it is what happens in these therapies on a day-to-day basis. It really is dependent on the provider and the people receiving it and how well they mesh. One more thing, sorry, I want to add too, is like another thing that really challenged me during the research process was, I didn't only interview behavioral therapy practitioners to understand the culture. I also interviewed recipients, so autistic adults who had received the therapies. I interviewed some autistic recipients who had also become behavioral therapists. And so I noticed that there's also a multiplicity of perspectives within the autistic self-advocacy world because these people also identified as self-advocates. And so it's very messy to just say, these therapies are awful. They always harm autistic people. And for me as a non-autistic person to say that, when some autistic self-advocates themselves, many, 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 most are against these therapists. But I also don't want to be that voice that erases those autistic voices who are saying, well, actually, like, I kind of like these therapies. They help me in this way, and I'm becoming a provider because. So that's another take home for me, that there's a lot of gray areas.
Is there anything else you think it's important to bring to the conversation today on this?
Listen to autistic people and what they say, take what they say seriously. Data isn't the whole story. It's part of the story. It can be an opening to a story, but people who receive, especially interventions, need to be the first people to go to when understanding how to evaluate those interventions.
Julia Gruson-Wood, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much for speaking with me and for this great conversation.
Julia Gruson-Wood is author of the forthcoming book, Autism and the Culture of Therapy, from UBC Press.
People First Radio, People First Media, and People First Stories are community media projects of Vancouver Island Mental Health Society and are produced in Nanaimo, British Columbia. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of Vancouver Island Mental Health Society or its broadcast, podcast, and social media partners.